Welcome to the Backyard Professor Chess videos. I'm up here at Blacktail. I've got the beautiful reservoir in the background. I'll take some video and show you at the end of this video some of the area I'm in. It's quite beautiful. It's an early morning, somewhat cool. Now, in previous videos, just the recent few on pawns, I was describing the idea of doubled pawns, isolated pawns, backward pawns, trying to give you a feel for pawn structure, weaknesses that happen, etc. And I now have an illustrated game on this theme that is extremely interesting. And I want to show you, this is out of Jeremy Silman's book, How to Reassess Your Chess, the 3rd edition. A game where Black plays an opening where he actually begs White to give him the added central control, an extra long file that only doubled pawns can bestow. This is a game by Kaplan and Larson in San Antonio in 1972. It's a very interesting illustration. The king pawn opening, I know Kraftmonk will like this. He hates the queen pawn openings. Well, you don't hate it, I know, but you think the manly opening is the pawn to king 4 or the e4, so we'll go with this, right? You can see again the central thrust. Always the central thrust. Now this is the Karo Khan, I do believe. Knight c3, and then d takes the e4 pawn immediately. So here we're beginning to have the battle for the center pretty quick. Knight takes the e4 pawn, of course. And now knight f6. Larson comes to knight f6. And the knight takes the knight at f6. And now g takes the knight. Now this is a very interesting, very speedy beginning of an exchange here. Silman says in the Karo Khan, White usually has control of the useful e5 square, which he does. He's controlling this square, see, in this Karo Khan. This is a square that can turn into a juicy home for a knight or a bishop. And in line, however, because of the way Larson has played this, his doubled pawn keeps the white pieces out of the e5 square. So you see the battle here, because of these doubled pawns, is this square. Now true, as far as the kingside castle goes, Black has already gotten his kingside pried open somewhat. But there is a dynamic potential in this position that Silman wants to share with us that I think is extremely, very educational. Bishop comes out to f5. Now this bishop steps outside of the pawn chain before he pushes his pawn. You notice that? That's one of the important points of pushing a bishop out in case you need to, which you usually do, need to occupy the center with pawns, or at least control it. You step outside the pawn chain first, then your bishop isn't bad. That's a nice little tip to know. You know, the more we learn, the more we know about chess, the stronger our games can get. This is the idea. Queen 7, white castles, and knight comes up to d7, and then he comes up to c4. You can see he's pushing the central pawn thrusts, and now he comes up to e6. So you can see Larson's idea. The bishop is extremely useful here, even though it's his bad bishop. So the term bad and good bishop doesn't mean a lot. It depends on how you set it up. Yeah? It's really important to recognize this. Now the bishop comes to d2. He's developing speedily. And the bishop comes up here to d6. So there is a good overall development so far, even though there has been a couple of quick exchanges. That completely changes the character of the game because of the pawn structure with the doubled pawns and the pawn structure with these pawns in the center. So very interesting. Now white pieces have no footholds in the center. The pieces can't get up into here. And what's stopping them is this doubled pawn. Isn't that interesting? That's kind of fun to see. So, if you were black and you had this particular situation, as we notice the imbalances of the chessboard, you can keep the white pieces out of the center. So why not make use of that open G file yourself? And you say, well, yeah, it goofed me up on castle and king side. But that doesn't make this side bad. I mean, it's bad, but why not put it to good use? I mean, this is beautifully sensible. I love how playing through the master games show us this. King comes over to H1. Rook, you may as well make use of that G file. That makes beautiful sense. And now he pushes the C5, and Silman's got a question mark here. Chasing the bishop from its strong diagonal is nice. The problem is, once again, every time you push a pawn, you leave weaknesses behind you. So what does the effect of moving this pawn do? Here, the pawn hits B5, this pawn hits C5, and this pawn also hits D5. When you push that pawn forward, you give up control of these two squares. You see that? Yeah, he is chasing the bishop away, but you're leaving more weak squares behind. And leaving the D5 square is too high a price to pay for chasing off that bishop, as he'll illustrate this. So the bishop does plot back to E7. Now queen comes over to C1. And now the bishop comes over here to E4. And this bishop comes up to F4. You see he's hitting the queen here. Queen pops over to A5. That's not a problem for him yet. Bishop comes down to G3. And now Larson pushes the H5 pawn, and he's got an exclamation point here. So let's hear what he says. All of the sudden, the weak H pawn, and the reason it's weak is because the G pawn has come over to this side. There is no pawn next to this. So an isolated pawn is a weak pawn, right? Although it's not on an open file as such. But look at the effects now of what can happen. All of a sudden, the H pawn can join in the fray of attacking the king. So rook goes to G1, and now the F pawn is pushed to F5. Now the weak doubled pawns, supposedly, begin to get very menacing. It gives excellent support to the bishop up here, doesn't it? Knight over to D2 to put the question to the bishop, and he doesn't bother with that. Now he puts the question to the bishop. You notice how he can use this H pawn as a battering ram? Isn't that fascinating to see? Bishop comes all the way up to D6, and this bishop comes back to D5. Bishop takes E7. Watch this. Bishop takes E7. Now, does Larson just simply respond to what his opponent's doing? No, he doesn't. He has a plan. He is using his so-called weaknesses and turning them into dynamic strengths. What he does is he takes the game to his opponent, and he continues pushing that H-pawn to H3. Now he's going to beat up the king side himself. He's got the file, and now he's going to destroy the king cover. This is exquisitely interesting. Even though his opponent has come up into here, he's carrying forward with his plan. He is trying to keep the initiative, isn't he? He's going to dictate how this game is played. Who would have guessed that the once despised H-pawn was destined for such great things, he says. F3, he pushes his pawn. The pawn takes G2, check. The rook takes G2. And you say, well, we've got a standoff of rooks on the open files. That's right, we sure do. Rook takes g2. King takes g2. And now finally, king takes e7. Black understands that he probably won't be able to mate his opponent. However, he has a new thing to crow about. White's pawn structure, interestingly enough, is now inferior to black's pawn structure. And just a few minutes ago, his structure was completely wiped out. Now he's got the powerful central control of both his pawns and pieces as opposed to white. Isn't that fun? You notice he gave up that d5 square when he pressed that pawn, and now this bishop is just solid coming at the king on that d5 square. Because he advanced that pawn, he lost control of that square, and Larsen jumps on it to use it. This is a very interesting idea. He has targets on d4. There's a weak pawn because it's blockaded, right? It's on an open file. He's got targets on f3. There's an isolated pawn all by himself that a piece has to protect and another piece has to protect. And he's got a weakness on h2 also. So, black is not in a bad position. Now knight comes up to c4. He's trying to centralize. And the bishop takes the knight at c4. White's knight could not be allowed to jump into d6. It would have been permanent there. That would have been an excellent outpost. So because Larsen was prepared by taking control of that weak square, he could exchange that knight that was going to become extremely powerful. So that's worth exchanging that knight for. And now bishop takes the c4, and the knight comes over here to f6. Now he's adding a superior minor piece to his list of positional advantages. Black is. Aside from d5, this knight has designs for the attractive f4 square. That's a very good square on the side where the king virtually has no cover. You notice that. His kingside protection is shattered. White's king, even though he ended up with the doubled pawns, is under pretty good cover. White's king is completely exposed, and black has access to him. This is a very interesting theme on this game. The queen comes up to f4, and the rook comes to d8, grabbing the open file and hitting the weak pawn. You notice that? He pushes his pawn to a3. He pushes his pawn to b6, directly challenging his center pawns. He comes up here to b4, putting the question to the queen. The queen simply comes down to a4. It's not much of a threat. Rook comes up to a2. B takes c5. So now he's beginning to take away the center of White's dominance. D takes c5. And now queen comes down here to d1. So black has broken through White's defensive barriers. So it's going to be a very interesting game. Black allowed White to get rid of his weak D pawn in exchange for complete domination of the open D file right through the center of the board. Isn't that beautiful? It's very interesting how he's done this, isn't it? I really like this. It's instructive to see how black keeps trading his positive imbalances in for another, but no less useful imbalance. You don't have to keep an imbalance the same throughout the course of the game. You can exchange it for a different one. Here, he had the file at one point here. He had the imbalance of a bad h-pawn, so he pushed the h-pawn and broke up White's kingside. Now, he's exchanged that for dominance in a central file. This is great chess. This is how you want to do it. Bishop comes down to f1. Rook goes to g8 check. The white king is not looking very healthy at this point, is he? King comes over to f2. Knight comes up to d5. queen pops down to d2. Now he's going to challenge the queen because she is too powerful on that file. There's too much bad that can happen, so the queen has to go, but black doesn't need to. He doesn't want to exchange the queen at this point. Now there are some times when you do want to exchange the queens. This particular board is not one of them because in an attack against the king, the queen can be very powerful, especially an exposed king like white's king is, right? So this is excellent. Rook comes over to b2. He's trying everything he can to exchange that queen. Queen simply takes the weak pawn on a3. Rook comes back over to a2. He's got the horizontal controlled, so to speak. And now queen simply takes b4. Black is simply obliterating white because of all of his weaknesses, isn't it? Now, white seeks to get a little bit of material. King's going to come up to f6. He's going to start centralizing his queen because he wants to go into an end game. He is up material. Now he wants to take it to an end game, and that's what you usually want to do. The white queen exchanges the queen at this point, and the knight takes the queen at this point. And now rook comes over to b7 to challenge the knight. The knight pops over here on the beautiful central outpost on d5. You notice how this square d5 has played such an important role ever since white pushed that pawn. This d5 has been a great point for the queen, the rook, and now the knight. It's a dominant position. Bishop comes up to c4. Rook goes back over here to c8. King comes up to g3. They've got to try to bring their kings into the game. It's the end game. And now he pushes the pawn f4 check against the king. The double pawn continues to play a useful role in this game. Notice that. Isn't that fascinating? It is an excellent opportunity for black to get a knight outpost on e3 now because of that pawn. Isn't that fun to see? King pops back down to f2. Knight immediately makes use of that outpost to e3, putting the question to the bishop and coming right after that king. It's a beautiful position to be in. Bishop comes down to d3. Rook goes over to h8. Of course, that makes beautiful sense. Rook comes over here to c7. He's got to try to get rid of this pawn so that he's got a chance in the endgame of putting that pawn into the queen. And now knight pops back up to d5. Rook takes the c6 pawn. And now knight comes to b4, and you can see the fantastic fork on the rook and the bishop. And it forces a decisive simplification, he says. Rook comes over to d6. Knight takes d3 check. Rook takes d3, uncheck. Now the rook takes h2, check. He's still got him where he wants him. King comes down to g1. Rook comes over to c2. Rook goes up to d4. Rook takes c5. King comes to f2. Now, sadly, he says, white is completely hopeless. The game is completely hopeless for white. Rook comes down to c2 check. King comes down to f1. King comes to g5. Rook goes to d8. He's got to try to get up behind the king. King comes to h4. Rook comes to g8 to block off the black king from coming into the action. And black's king cannot be allowed to come into g3 or this game is in real trouble, right? So, he pushes his second doubled pawn. All this game, these doubled pawns have been absolutely fabulous. Have you noticed that? Isn't that fun to see that? The f7 pawn plays a useful but quiet role through the game by defending e6, he said. Now it turns active in the events and prepares to turn the e-pawn into a monster. And it's a doubled pawn. Rook to g6. He's trying to hit the weakness, of course. He's not going to allow that. Now he's bringing this pawn some support, e5. Rook comes over here to e6. And now he pushes the pawn to e4. Can you see how powerful these doubled pawns have played a role in this game? F takes e4, of course. F takes e4, of course. Rook takes e4, of course. But he's still up material, and now the king got into g3 anyway. There's nothing he could do to stop that king from getting into g3. So white, rook goes to e8. And black goes rook to c1, and this is where white resigned. Isn't it fascinating, he says, that the doubled f pawn is going to end up becoming a queen? And that was supposed to be the weakness in the game. So there's a wonderful illustrated game of not necessarily freaking out because you end up with doubled pawns. And if your opponent ends up with doubled pawns, you've got to pay attention to those because they can turn into power plays like this game illustrates. So there's your chessercise. I thought this was a great illustrated game. Thanks for watching my videos. Happy chessercising, happy checkmating, happy checking, happy chess playing, happy tournament going, happy, happy, joy, joy. Have a happy life. Hey, we're alive. It's great to be alive, right? And in the meantime, I'm going to show you some video of this area, so stay tuned. I'll show it to you after this video is over. Thanks for watching my videos, and I will see you in the next video.